On July 4th, 1776, 56 men pledged to one another their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Today, we call these men America's founding fathers. They make this pledge not only to one another, but in support of America's Declaration of Independence, with Almighty God as their witness. That declaration will forever change the course of human history. It will lay the foundation for one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Today, we take our independence for granted. But in the months and years leading up to July 1776, independence was far from guaranteed. The Declaration of Independence is not born out of a single moment of inspiration. It is the culmination of one of the greatest political dramas in history, a fierce struggle of ideas, interests, fears, ambitions, and convictions.
This was a dramatic step. And the signers of the Declaration knew exactly what would happen if it failed.
They knew that this would be regarded by the king and Parliament as an act of treason. They knew that if this effort, the Revolutionary War effort, didn't succeed, they would all hang.
These were people who had a lot to lose, and they were willing to put all of that up to risk everything that they had to create this new country, to secure their inalienable rights and our inalienable rights.
This is the story of how 56 men, chosen by their countrymen, come to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. In August of 1775, King George III of Great Britain has to make a decision. Will he declare the American colonies his American colonies in a state of rebellion? The deteriorating relationship between Britain and her American colonies, a result of the aftermath of the French and Indian War, has come to define George III's reign at the expense of his other ambitions.
George III is really worried about corruption in Parliament. He's worried about parliamentary leaders who are so powerful, they're almost acting like what we Americans would think of as city bosses. They want to bully George III into being their puppet, and he's not willing to be bullied. George III sees himself as someone who's restoring balance to the British Constitution.
Restoring balance to the British Constitution, however, is proving to be difficult. In the 12 years since the French and Indian War, a war that expanded the British Empire and ran Britain's main rival, France, largely out of the New World, an aggressive parliament has badly strained Britain's relationship with its American colonies. Winning an empire is one thing, governing an empire is another.
In some ways, the British had just recognized in the last 15 years before then, oh my goodness, we're an empire. They had been so busy with their civil wars in the 17th century and then fighting the Dutch and the French and to be the Spanish, that they had been paying attention to this empire that went from 200,000 people in 1700 to 2 million, roughly speaking, in 1770.
But Britain's victory in the French and Indian War comes at a price. The war nearly doubles Britain's national debt, and the cost of administering this empire isn't cheap. So Parliament decides to tax the American colonists and regulate their activities. This decision would drive a wedge between Britain and the American colonists, who have spent over 150 years forging their own identity in the New World.
In order to create and sustain the America that we know and love, we certainly have ideals that we aspire to. We certainly have moral principles that we aspire to, but those ideals in many ways are on top of a culture. And that's a culture that came directly from Great Britain.
It was the founders' education and sensibilities and sobriety that made the Declaration and the Revolution succeed, but they were working with a broad middle class.
The American people, that is the British subjects residing in what was then colonial America, were somewhat unique in the degree to which they had, many of them being self-taught, they had learned about their rights as English subjects.
You can't have the Declaration, you can't have the United States without the people. In the preceding generation, even before the French and Indian War, so as early as the 1740s, if you look at art in the colonies, architecture, even colonial portraiture, there was the emergence of what early American historians call country ideology, which came from England, from the Midlands, from the rural parts of England. And what that meant was there was a comfort level among the colonists to entertain the notion that while they were in fact inheriting culturally what it was to be British, that they were something you would call an American.
All of the sudden, Britain finds itself in debt, and they decide to tax the American colonists. And for quite a long time, the American colonists had governed themselves.
That ability to govern, for people to govern themselves, is the number one bulwark against large government and against tyranny.
From 1763 to 1776, and literally every year, there was one major piece of legislation from Parliament that not only had something to do with the French and Indian War, and not only had something to do with getting the American colonists to participate in the repayment of that, but also had something to do with inflaming passions among very rational colonists that Parliament was overreaching.
But before Britain taxes the American colonists, it issues the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented colonists from settling over an arbitrary line drawn through the Appalachian Mountains. This infuriated the colonists because America was still largely an agrarian society, and that land west was for their children and their grandchildren to civilize and cultivate. Of course, Britain needs to station troops on the frontier to enforce the Proclamation of 1763. But troops, as Britain knew well from the debt racked up during the French and Indian War, cost money. To cover the cost, Parliament decides to impose new taxes on the American colonists. In 1764, Parliament passes the Sugar Act, a duty on molasses and other sugary goods to raise revenue from the American colonists. And a year later, Parliament passes the Stamp Act. It's the first internal tax on the colonists, and it requires all of your paper goods, your legal documents, academic degrees, newspapers, even your playing cards needed a stamp proving that you'd done your duty by paying your duties. Under an immense amount of pressure, Parliament decides to rescind the Stamp Act just 1 year later. But Parliament is not just going to rescind this tax without telling the American colonists who's boss. Parliament passes the Declaratory Act, which asserts that in all cases whatsoever, Parliament has supreme authority over the colonies. Just a little over a year later, in June of 1767, Parliament is back with more taxes, this time in the form of the Townshend Acts, a series of acts that impose taxes on goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And the recoil to the Townshend Acts in the colonies is enough for Parliament to rescind most of those taxes. But it leaves in place a tax on tea.
Every action has a reaction.
It leads to the Boston Tea Party. And the reason that happens after a couple of intervening episodes is because the British tried to save the East India Company, by imposing a monopoly on tea. Did Americans really care about which tea they were brewing, where that came from? No. They cared about the monopoly, and they cared about yet another example of Parliament overreaching.
And Parliament, which had repeatedly asserted its supreme authority over the colonists, is not just going to let the Boston Tea Party go unpunished. It cracks down hard with the Intolerable Acts, which shuts down the port of Boston, alters the colony's government, and curtails the colonists' liberties, such as the ability to hold town meetings.
George Washington thought the Tea Party was excessive. And then he saw the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, Parliament called them, and said, whoa, we better unite with Boston, we have no choice.
Colonists up and down the eastern seaboard take note of the British crackdown on Boston. By late summer of 1774, people across the colonies are calling on their leaders to gather together to organize some kind of response. And on September 5th, 1774, the First Continental Congress meets here at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. The delegates that descend on Philadelphia, George Washington, John Jay, Patrick Henry, and John and Samuel Adams, just to name a few, represent different colonies, different interests, and different visions of the future. And many of them had never met.
And to put it bluntly, it's kind of like dogs sniffing each other's rear ends. They're getting to know the leadership of the other colonies. They're the ones used to talking a lot. They come together, you're full of room for people who are used to being the leaders. And they have to sort out the new hierarchy in the new room. So there's a lot going on in that room as they meet each other.
Some of the delegates who meet here, such as John Adams of Massachusetts, see the possibility of independence on the horizon, while others like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania believed that declaring independence would be like sailing into a storm on a paper skiff.
John Adams was a classic statesman.
You know, he's a bit of a stubborn guy, a little prickly at times, but absolutely brilliant.
It wasn't the backslapper that was probably getting all of the votes, but he was this constant engine of determination for this thing to actually happen.
John Dickinson is perhaps the paragon of an American moderate. So he believes that the Parliament is treating the American colonies in an unjust way, but Dickinson believes that there really is a chance to win the King, George III, over to the side of the American colonies. And John Adams says this man is a fool. This man is being treated as if he's a genius, but actually, by delaying independence, he's making things worse for everyone.
The First Continental Congress organizes a boycott of British goods, passes the Declaration and Resolves, and petitions for the restoration of their liberties as British subjects. The delegates in Philadelphia answer the big question. Yes, the American colonies can act as one. The pressure between Britain and her American colonies continued to build. To understand how that pressure would ultimately erupt, we visited the Museum of the American Revolution and spoke with its president and CEO, Dr. R. Scott Stevenson.
So all through that winter of 1774-75, you have to imagine communities where men are enrolling in these minute companies, and they begin amassing military supplies, even food, provisions, ammunition, etc., out near Concord, Massachusetts. So this was a powder keg that was waiting for a spark to ignite it.
And everything changes in April. On April 19th, 1775, a group of British regulars finds itself in armed conflict with the American colonists, with the militia.
They've been preparing for this eventuality for months now. The confrontation first happens on Lexington Green. This is where the first Americans are killed in an exchange of fire. 8 Americans fell mortally wounded there, others were wounded, and then that British column continues on to its original goal of Concord, Massachusetts.
And so tell us what we're looking at here.
This is a view looking sort of to the northwest at the Old North Bridge, so just outside of the town of Concord. It was engraved by a Revolutionary War soldier named Amos Doolittle. That's the bridge, the Old North Bridge, and the fighting then breaks out across this bridge. It's a sharp action, maybe 15 minutes, but that's where the first British soldiers fell dead on the morning of April 19th, 1775.
3 weeks later, the Continental Congress reconvenes here at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775. It is a much different world from when these delegates last saw one another. Things are changing at a breakneck pace. It has just been 3 weeks since the battles of Lexington and Concord, and this time, the questions facing Congress are even more serious.
Well, they've got to stand up an army, and they've got to find somebody who can organize that army, and that is going to be a very difficult challenge.
Well, one of the delegates who came regularly to the Continental Congress meetings, sat on all the military committees, wearing his militia uniform was George Washington, the delegate from Virginia. He wanted to signal that he was being deadly serious.
By the time of the Declaration, Washington was probably the most renowned American military figure in the colonies because he had served admirably well on behalf of the British in defeating the French.
John Adams just nominates, while the debate's going on, he says, you know what, I'm just going to nominate Washington.
And so Washington was given this commission as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army.
So therefore you have Virginia, a Southern man, supporting the New England Army to show the union between North and South.
Building unity was certainly essential for them in that moment because they were going up against the world's greatest superpower.
But even among the patriots and revolutionaries, there is a spectrum of opinion about whether reconciliation with the king is possible or whether independence is not only necessary, but also maybe the right and best thing to do. Many Americans sort of take a default view saying that, well, look, we've always been British subjects, we've always loved the king, why would we want to break away now? And yet there's a faction of the Continental Congress, even from the beginning, which recognizes that ultimately not only is independence going to be necessary, but also it's the right thing to do as well.
John Adams said, when the sword is drawn, throw away the scabbard. It's too late. but people took time to be reconciled to the fact that we were going to be independent. We had to fight for it.
Even though war has effectively already broken out, John Adams still holds the minority opinion in Congress. The Second Continental Congress still seeks reconciliation with Great Britain, but independence is becoming an increasingly popular position. So Congress decides to adopt 2 resolutions, each for a different audience, stating their desire for reconciliation and describing why they created this army. The first document is directed towards the people. It's written by John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson, and it's called The Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. It seeks to explain that defending their rights as Englishmen requires the creation of the Continental Army, and that the enjoyment of those rights as Englishmen is still very much their intent. The other is directed towards the king, the Olive Branch Petition, written primarily by John Dickinson, and it appeals to King George III for a redress of their grievances. It calls on the king to protect the colonists from Parliament. Across the Atlantic, King George III is facing a very similar choice. Will he respond to the colonists' repeated petitions and redress their grievances over the wishes of Parliament, or will he declare a rebellion? George III wants to restore some glory to the monarchy, and checking Parliament by restoring the colonists' liberties could do just that. After all, the king is the original guarantor of Britain's American colonies. On the other hand, declaring the colonies in rebellion could also restore some of the king's power because he would be wielding his authority in support of, but also over, Parliament. Before the Olive Branch Petition even reaches him, George III declares the American colonies in rebellion.
He does it from the throne, and he declares rebellion. And in doing so, he instructs all of his subjects, in his military especially, but throughout his colonies, to act against them and try to find them and bring them to justice.
Things are much worse than those who were optimistic about the Olive Branch Petition had thought. All along, they had thought the king will save us from the wicked Parliament. And now they're starting to realize the king is part of the problem.
But that's a shift, that's an inflection point. And now it's going to be decided by force.
And then in early January of 1776, Thomas Paine, a recent arrival from Britain, publishes his pamphlet Common Sense. And Common Sense hits like a rocket. He takes it directly to the king. For example, how does he describe the ancestors of the King of England, going back to William? He calls him a French bastard, an armed banditti, invading England. And so this helps transform American public opinion from reluctant to independent to seeing it as common sense.
One very important aspect of this to understand is the extent to which the arguments and the development of this argument within the Continental Congress was amazingly a grassroots activity.
These ideas that were being espoused were revolutionary, and these were real people who were going to have to fight for them. This were real country, and they knew the land, and they were willing to die for it.
The people start pushing things, resolves from counties, from towns, start saying, well, what about independence?
Fervor for independence is spreading like wildfire, sparked by conflict in Boston, Lexington, and Concord, and encouraged by sermons, newspapers, and pamphlets. From the pulpit to the pages of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Americans were beginning to see independence as both a political necessity and a philosophical right. But to do anything, they'll need to act together through the Continental Congress.
Each colonial legislature, colonial assembly, elects delegates to the convention. They send instructions, and those instructions basically are how far the delegation can go on the question of independence. This is explicitly discussed in every one of the colonial assemblies. There's an additional challenge, and that is that these delegations have a single vote. So it's not one delegate, one vote, it's one colony, one vote. And that means that the debates that are really fierce happen within the colonial delegations themselves. Kind of fun for us to think about many years later, not fun if you were those delegates.
The colonies are not marching in lockstep towards independence. Interestingly, they are divided geographically. The northern and southern colonies are largely for independence, but the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, are hesitant.
You had to have the middle too. Otherwise, you would have, these, maybe two separate confederacies fighting for independence, and they would be destroyed by the British.
As Massachusetts is to the north or Virginia is to the south, Pennsylvania is to the middle colonies. Advocates for independence believe that if they can get Pennsylvania to flip, the rest of the middle colonies may follow. The road to independence does not run through Boston or Williamsburg. It runs through Philadelphia.
Pennsylvania is a very interesting colony. It's a big colony, it's a wealthy colony. It has a lot of liberty. It was founded by the Quakers, who were pacifists, who welcome all religions, etc.
And the ones who are not outright pacifists were still very reluctant to have, this act of defiance, to take up arms against an authority. It seemed to many of them a very unchristian thing to do.
Pennsylvania is reluctant, but elections slated for May 1st, 1776 gives supporters of independence a massive opportunity to flip the Pennsylvania Assembly to pro-independence. But things don't go as planned for those pushing independence. John Dickinson, himself a delegate to the Continental Congress, helps organize against declaring independence. And in that election, his side ultimately wins. This isn't the only check on colonial momentum towards independence. By the spring of 1776, many colonial governments are breaking down. Some delegates still need the authority to declare independence, and several colonies remain hesitant to give it to them. But a resolution from Richard Henry Lee of Virginia will force the question on everyone's minds. We met with Sarah Karpinski, one of the National Park Service's interpretive park rangers, inside Independence Hall, inside the room where it happened, to discuss Lee's move towards independence.
Independence is in the air, and it's been this sort of really slow growing snowball over the first year of the war. And Virginia, being a very leading group in this room, get news from their legislature like, yes, this is what we should be doing. This is the conversation we should be having. So on June 7th of 1776, Richard Henry Lee does bring in the resolution for independency into this room.
This is the actual act of the Continental Congress, the resolution that makes America independent.
It's actually a threefold motion, not just for independence. One is that the colonies together should declare themselves to be free and independent. It's a motion for some sort of confederation, which leads to the Articles of Confederation. And thirdly, it's a motion to seek a foreign alliance, which eventually will be the French alliance. So it really is an all-encompassing motion that implies not only a break with England, but a war with England for which we would have an alliance, and developing a constitutional grounding of a new country. It's almost too much for them to handle. And they debated a little bit and they immediately set it aside. We've got to sit on this and think about it. We've got to get instructions. We've got to put things off until we come to some sort of consensus.
You've got to get 13 clocks to strike at the same time. And of course, that's going to require a tremendous feat of coordination.
We realized the states have to have time to think about it, send news back. So we table active discussion in the Committee of the Whole for another 3 weeks.
No one knows whether Congress will ultimately vote for independence or not, but if that day comes, they intend to be ready. While delegates work to build consensus, Congress begins preparing the machinery of a new nation, including appointing a committee of 5 to draft a declaration of independence.
The Committee of 5 was representative of a cross-section of the colonies. Benjamin Franklin, the most distinguished American colonists at the time, one of the most famous men in the world. John Adams, the leader of probably the most important man of Congress. He's called the Atlas of Independence. Jefferson called him the Declaration's Atlas on the floor. Right? He's the leader pushing for independence.
Robert Livingston of New York. Livingston of New York is not in favor of independence. He's not quite a loyalist, but he's not in favor of that move yet. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and a young delegate, Thomas Jefferson, a young man from Virginia.
He is seen as being the Virginian who is the best writer of all, and he's already participated in a number of important documents of various kinds that have been issued by the Continental Congress. At first, it's not really clear who's going to be the dominant voice within this committee.
Sherman of Connecticut, he's full on committed, but it turns out he's just not a good writer. Ben Franklin, at this point, has gout. He's still sharp and contributes, but he's not as active.
John Adams was a prophet vindicated at this point because he had been pushing for independence at a very early stage and had always been, sort of blocked and overshadowed by John Dickinson. He is a natural choice to be the man to write the Declaration of Independence.
But the task will fall to Thomas Jefferson. At just 33 years old, Jefferson is a rising figure in American politics, brilliant, ambitious, and already known for his pen. And this young Virginian will be asked to give voice to a nation.
The basic story is Jefferson became the primary draftsman. The question is how.
John Adams has a famous letter in which he describes the events that led to Jefferson's drafting of the Declaration. John Adams instructs Jefferson to write it for three reasons in particular.
One, I'm offensive to everybody. They like you, so they won't just oppose it because the wrong person wrote it.
Two, I'm from Massachusetts, and someone from outside of Massachusetts, indeed a Virginian, should write it.
And because you are such a wonderful writer, Jefferson, you should write it.
Now, Jefferson remembers things somewhat differently, without Adams playing quite as prominent a role.
And Jefferson, seeing this many years later, and says, that's not quite how I remember it, but it's not certain that's not what happened. It's not exactly clear how Jefferson wound up being the primary draftsman of the Declaration.
Adams convinces Jefferson to take the lead in the draft. They have a meeting to discuss how to lay it out, and Jefferson goes home to start writing.
Jefferson spends the next few sweltering weeks of June here at the Graff House, which we now call Declaration House, drafting the Declaration of Independence. What he produces is a devastatingly clear yet complex moral, philosophical, and legal case in three parts to explain why America is compelled to sever the ties that bind it to Great Britain.
You've got basically three elements to the Declaration of Independence. In the first part of it, you have a statement of these universal truths. The second part consists of a lengthy indictment against the Crown and Parliament, written directly as against His Majesty King George III. And then the final component of it, the coup de grace, announces and declares, okay, we're now independent. We are our own country.
The thing that I think is really important to underline here, however, is that the Declaration of Independence is not just Thomas Jefferson's view.
He calls it an expression of the American mind. He's writing, what do all these people across these colonies have in common? What principles, what philosophic traditions, and they're all synthesized brilliantly in the Declaration of Independence.
There is, a broad tradition of both ancient and modern natural law that has informed the Declaration of Independence.
Adams could read Latin and Greek, so could Jefferson. They were all very well educated. And so they came to this moment knowing much of the things that were being written by Montesquieu and Rousseau and David Hume and Locke and their ancient precedents, such as Aristotle's Politics, Cicero's De Republica, things like that. So they were not naive.
All of them were deeply rooted in history, deeply rooted in political philosophy. They understood the development of the West, the confluence of Athens and Jerusalem, how that was brought together throughout medieval Europe, how they were standing on top of a long history, both intellectually and politically.
Human nature doesn't change. Morality doesn't change. Principles don't change. What has been true today was true thousands of years ago. And that understanding has implications for how we understand history, which means if human beings have always been the same, that means we can learn from history.
Jefferson presents his draft of the Declaration of Independence to the other members of the Committee of Five. The committee immediately sees that this treasonous document is passionate but well-reasoned, current with all the latest abuses by the king, while drawing on ancient wisdom. For all of its eloquence, they do have some edits. The most notable edit the committee makes is to the first sentence of the second paragraph. Jefferson's initial draft reads, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation, they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The committee replaces sacred and undeniable with self-evident. The committee also makes clear that man's creator is the source of his rights. As the Committee of Five edits Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, Washington sees the British are maneuvering. They are preparing for a large-scale attack on the Continental Army. And it's been a year since he's become commander-in-chief of that army, and he desperately needs to give his troops a cause worth fighting for.
Everyone realizes the object of that campaign of 1776 will be Manhattan Island in New York City. This is a deep water port, very, very strategic. It controls access to the Hudson River, which is a water communication with Canada. British strategy, actually for most of the beginning half of the Revolutionary War, was based on the theory that the real troublemakers were the New Englanders. And if you could control New York City and that Hudson River corridor and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, the rebellion would sort of wither on the vine. So as Congress is debating the Lee Resolution, as the Committee of Five are preparing a Declaration of Independence, this British fleet is beginning to gather in New York Bay.
As Washington watches the British prepare for an all-out assault on New York, colonial governments holding out for reconciliation start to have the realization that their position is no longer tenable. In those weeks in June of '76, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, after arresting their royal governor, all decide to grant their delegates the authority to vote on the issue of independence. Even still, independence is far from a sure thing. The question of independence will be vigorously debated when the Continental Congress returns to the Lee Resolution on July 1st. It's a clash of two titans of Congress, John Adams arguing for independence and John Dickinson arguing against.
And the first man to rise, of course, anticipated, is John Adams. John Adams, Jefferson describes as the Colossus on the floor. And he speaks for some number of hours.
John Adams gave what was by all accounts the best speech of his life, and there's no record of it.
He's responded to, most importantly, by John Dickinson, who wasn't in principle opposed to independence. He saw that was going to happen. He knew it was coming, but he didn't think the timing was right. This was not the moment. It was a question they debated at great length, the question of prudence. Is this the prudent thing to do? John Adams won that debate.
He was remarkably persuasive in making the final eloquent appeal for Americans, for the colonists to vote for independence.
It was emotional, it was powerful, it was incisive, it was careful. It was, it won the day in a very powerful way.
But as Congress wraps up the debate over the Lee Resolution, it's unclear if some colonies would vote in favor. In an initial vote, Pennsylvania and South Carolina vote against. Delaware's delegation is divided, and New York still does not have instructions, partly due to the chaos caused by the impending British invasion. But they need unanimity. So Edward Rutledge, a delegate from South Carolina who had just argued against the Lee Resolution with Dickinson on the floor, moves to delay the vote until the next day. With a wink and a nudge, he suggests that with a little rest, Congress might achieve unanimity. We joined Hans Zieger, president of the Jack Miller Center, outside where many of the delegates decided to get their rest.
Well, I'm sure there was time spent at Independence Hall, but there was also a lot of time spent at places like City Tavern. Just imagine the kinds of conversations that were happening at City Tavern and some other establishments around Philadelphia. You are putting your lives, your fortunes, and your sacred honor at stake on this. And so therefore you better be really sure about it. And they get the buy-in through the kinds of repeated conversations and little groups that are happening at City Tavern and other places around Philadelphia in those critical hours leading up to that vote.
The next morning, several important things happen. One is South Carolina changes its vote. They had originally voted against it, now they vote in favor of it. That probably has something to do with the fact that British ships were spotted off the harbor of Charleston. Pennsylvania changes its vote because John Dickinson, who thought the declaration was imprudent and voted against it on July 1st, decides not to come to Congress that day. He allows it to pass.
And one delegate from Delaware, absent from the Continental Congress, puts his life on the line to have Delaware vote in favor of independence.
The Caesar Rodney story, I think, is one of the greatest in American history. Here's this relatively elderly man suffering from some kind of cancer in his face, who's back home in Delaware thinking that the Congress is going to resolve this question without him. But the problem is there are 3 members of the Delaware delegation to Congress, and therefore there are 2 present in Philadelphia, and they're on opposite sides of the question. So this message gets to Mr. Rodney. It is, as the tale goes, although this is a real story, late at night, he immediately gets on his horse, not feeling great, rides the 70 miles and arrives in Philadelphia just as the voting has begun so he can break the tie. Without that, you don't have on July 2nd the passing of the resolution.
The July 2nd vote on the Lee resolution is 12 in favor, none opposed. New York abstains and will later receive its instructions to support independence. But now the Continental Congress needs to put this cause of independence into words, and they turn to editing Thomas Jefferson's Declaration.
They make about 80 changes to this document. Some of them are quite small, grammatical changes, spelling and word order changes, but some of them are quite significant. Things like removing a grievance about blaming the King of England for the North Atlantic slave trade. We're trying to gain consensus and broad appeal to all of the colonies in this room. And that gets removed, not necessarily with Jefferson's thrills about this, because this document needs to broadly appeal, not just to the guys in this room, but to the world out there, including the people in all of these colonies.
Jefferson, who was a great American, was perhaps the most prideful when it came to his own words, which were admittedly very eloquent. And so he is smarting, to say the least, over all of these revisions to his perfect draft of what we know as the Declaration of Independence. And the sage Ben Franklin steps in and tells Mr. Jefferson a really important tale, something that has sort of become a parable of early American history. And it's about John Thompson, his hatter friend. Mr. Thompson, according to Franklin, was establishing his hatter business, came up with this beautiful sign, John Thompson, maker and seller of hats for ready money, meaning cash. And he says to 5 of his friends, give me feedback on this sign. And basically, after going through all 5 of those suggestions by his friends, he's left with a sign that says, John Thompson.
The final text, in some ways, is a little less emotional than the original text. Jefferson's original text talked about the last stab of agonizing affection, that we were driven away by the king. We could have been a great people together, and you guys blew it.
Really transforms his draft into a committee draft, into the Continental Congress's draft, into a statement of a Congress. And that's a different thing by the time you get to the end of it.
On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress unanimously vote in favor of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams writes his wife Abigail Adams that the day of our independence will be celebrated by Americans throughout the centuries. He writes, it ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. By being an early advocate for independence, John Adams proves his political foresight. But now, he sees challenging times ahead. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not, John Adams writes Abigail. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not.
It's not until August, later, that they come together for another meeting of the Continental Congress and formally sign the document. The heaviness of that moment must have been intense, because they don't sign as delegates. They don't sign formally as groups of colonies. They sign independently, one at a time.
When I have constituents in town from Utah and I show them around the Capitol, I show them the Trumbull painting in the Capitol Rotunda depicting the moment of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And I always point out that the faces that you see in that room, this room full of distinguished, accomplished individuals, very well educated, I believe raised up by Almighty God to that very purpose. Their expressions are somber because they knew they were signing their own death warrants. They knew that this would be regarded by the king and Parliament as an act of treason. They knew that if this effort, the Revolutionary War effort, didn't succeed, they would all hang.
It's first signed by John Hancock, famously writes very large letters. And he says that now the King of England can read it without his glasses, and double the price on my head. There's a lot of gallows humor at this moment from what we have been told. John Hancock passes the pen to someone else and said, "We must all hang together." Ben Franklin apparently quipped, "Yes, we must all hang together, or assuredly we will all hang separately."
Benjamin Harrison, big burly Virginian, ancestor of two presidents, turned to Elbridge Gerry, who was a politician in Massachusetts, future vice president. And he says, "I am more fortunate than you, for I am big and heavy, and when they hang us, I will die instantly. For you are so small, you will twist in the breeze for a while before you go."
Washington is visiting Philadelphia during the debates. He writes his brother, makes a very interesting comment, which I never quite understood. And he says, "We must make this declaration, or we'll all surely be hanged, etc., etc." And I always wondered, what does etc., etc. mean? What's worse than hanging? The punishment for treason in England to that day was still to be hanged, to be drawn and quartered. I can't imagine that they didn't understand that.
Not every delegate to the Continental Congress has voted for the Declaration and ultimately winds up signing it. And it's kind of the tragedy of John Dickinson's life that he continues to be something of a holdout, and he doesn't sign the Declaration. John Dickinson actually did play a very important role, but unfortunately he got perhaps the biggest question of all wrong, and that was the question of independence.
Word of America's independence begins to spread throughout the colonies, now states. The Declaration of Independence is rushed off to printing presses, read aloud in churches, taverns, and public squares across this new country.
The promulgation of that declaration happens in all kinds of places. It happens in places like City Tavern. It happens in church pulpits. It happens on the battlefields where the Declaration is read to the troops.
Perhaps the best example of how the Declaration of Independence was received is by George Washington in New York.
He instructs the Declaration to be read in a loud voice publicly, which meant to his army collected, but also anybody else who was around, and they were all gathered. So that must have been a very powerful moment, because Washington's heart knew. He knew it was coming. He follows politics. He knew that's what he wanted. And now, a year after he had been commander-in-chief, a year after the war had already been going, finally, the Continental Congress has declared independence, and we are now an independent nation, and we now have something to fight for.
For 250 years, the Declaration of Independence has given the American people something to fight for. The experience of our founding fathers in the lead up to the Declaration of Independence show us that our liberties are a great inheritance that we must protect and preserve in every generation. The principles and the politics of the Declaration of Independence show us how to do just that.
What is the Declaration of Independence? I think it was and always has been our mission statement as a country, as a nation. What is it? Who are we? What do we stand for? And the ideas espoused in that document that was signed for the whole world to see laid it all out in plain terms that has inspired generations of Americans and people around the world ever since.
The Declaration of Independence is oftentimes seen as an abstract statement of rights. And it does have an abstract statements of rights in it. The famous second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What's important for us to realize, especially if we're thinking about the politics of it, is that after that statement of abstract truths, the next sentence begins with the word prudence, which is the most classical word in the whole document, but also signals that their understanding of politics was different than the one we have today.
And the importance of that wasn't just for that generation, but was to signify for every subsequent generation in America, and for that matter across the world, that those principles articulated in the Declaration, but by that particular people, had to be fought for. That there's nothing more important for which we would give our lives.
Liberty doesn't want pass from one generation to the next through the bloodstream. It has to be fought for, defended, won with every generation. In that respect, the principles embedded in and expressed very articulately within the Declaration of Independence are every bit as relevant today as they were in 1776.
It was a tough revolution, but it was largely a political revolution based on the idea that people could be self-governed politically.
Sustaining a republic is one of the hardest things to do. Vince Lombardi said one of the hardest things in sports is not just excellence, it's sustained excellence. Sustained excellence, sustained dedication to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. God did not give you the right to let someone else govern for you. You're an equal. It's your job to step up. It's easier to let someone else do it. That's the challenge.
It's the narrative of who we are. It defines who we are today.
The incredible people who are willing to sacrifice everything to give us the country that we have today. I think that is something that we should be proud of as Americans. And I think whenever you have that pride, you realize that America is a country that's worth fighting to preserve.
I think it's that kind of courage that we can learn from even this day, that we say, we're Americans, this is what our country's about, and we're willing to fight for it for the next generation so that America 250 is America 500 and beyond.
The most important thing that we can do is to conduct our lives in a way, not just professionally, not just politically, but personally, as befitting a people who have God's greatest gift, which isn't just what's wired on our soul. Every human is wired to be free, but that we have the privilege of waking up every day. And if we do our lives well, hundreds of years of Americans get to do the same in the greatest, most noble experiment in civil society. Why? Because of the Declaration and the people who created it.
Each 4th of July, we celebrate America's independence exactly as John Adams hoped we would, with parades, bonfires, and fireworks. Yet amid all the celebration, it's easy to lose sight of the gravity of what we're commemorating. We are celebrating a political act that would reverberate throughout the centuries, a solemn pledge made by our ancestors who risked everything for their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every generation of Americans has been called to renew that pledge in its own time. And now that responsibility belongs to us. America's independence is providential, not predetermined. And preserving the republic our forebears entrusted to us will require the virtues of the founding generation, their courage, their prudence, their conviction, and their willingness to sacrifice for truths greater than themselves. And if called upon, we must also pledge to one another, as they did, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.